The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Fear is the Mind Killer. I know. Somebody's going to be upset about this from the beginning because that's a Dune quote, and this is going to have absolutely nothing to do with Dune. Apart from it does touch on some sci-fi elements. It was just a shorter label than the first one I came up with, which was Why Be Afraid of Things That Aren't Real? Now, I'm going to show you something that I pulled off Facebook. I'm not completely sure that it's real, and I'll explain why not. But this was posted by a mom who said, we got Happy Meals from McDonald's today for lunch. Pokemon cards were the prize. I knew Pokemon was demonic, even when my son was little, but never saw the cards up close and personal. Wow, energy is attached, and it's even capitalized like it's deified. After we threw them away, we had a great conversation about not allowing anything that's not of God into our homes and lives, even if our friends are doing it. Call me legalistic, old school, fanatical. I squarely own that one, but I won't allow magic, sorcery, New Age, Eastern religion, or anything with, quote, energy attached in my home. Now, one of the reasons that I suspect this might not be real is because if you look at the spelling of Pokemon, it's correct. It includes the E acute, which I wouldn't suspect that most people who find themselves terrified of cards in a card game would know how to even include an E acute in their spelling of this. For most Westerners who are likely to have sort of an ignorant, fearful view of this, I would imagine they wouldn't even be able to find character map. But set all of that aside and treat it like it's real, because I know of people who have these views like this, and was at one point one of them. So I was born in 1969 and grew up in the 70s and early 80s. And there were a number of things that I was discouraged from participating with or flat out told that I couldn't. I remember I had a friend who is still an acquaintance on Facebook and actually messaged me the other day. So, hi, Daniel. He introduced me to Lord of the Rings. I believe he was reading the Silmarillion at the time and then explained to me what it was all from and all of that stuff. But I also had friends like Tom, who may or may not still be on my Facebook, who introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons. And the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, I had one of those boxes. And I mean, you had to like use crayons to scribble in the numbers on the dice, fill in the little gap. I mean, it was cheaply put together, but it was really interesting. It was the first game of its type that I ever had a chance to play. And I didn't play much because it was demonic. And so I ended up getting rid of it and just not playing. By the time I got around to playing Magic the Gathering, which was in beta in 1993, and I still play today, but by then I wasn't as worried about the satanic nature of card games and things like that. Perhaps my mind had already been polluted and poisoned by demons, but by the time that happened, and then video games, more intense video games followed shortly thereafter, where I was playing, Eye of the Beholder on the PC, it didn't faze me at all. But it would have still terrified and upset many of the people in my family and in my churches. So while I was still a Christian at the time that I started playing some of these, the earlier stuff is when I was a kid and a Christian. Now, some people might ask, does this person not understand that fantasy exists? Yes, they do. They absolutely know fantasy exists, but they view fantasy that is tied up with magic and demons and spells and things like that. They view that fantasy as a way to hide or cover the fact that there is real magic and demons and things like that. And the perspective, and this isn't just from Chick Tracts, although it's in there and is held by many of the people that I grew up with, they view it as a doorway, a gateway. You've opened yourself up to the possibility. You no longer think it's real, and now you are susceptible to what the devil would like to do to you. And it's very difficult for people, especially those who view the Bible as a literal guidebook and that it means what it says. It's very difficult to convince them that something like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever else isn't demonic, because the book that they revere and point to on a regular basis tells them that those things are all real. I mean, Exodus 28:2-18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Leviticus 19:26 warns against using enchantments and magic. It says, I think the language there actually says observe times, but the Hebrew word there is basically talking about magic. In the very next chapter, Leviticus 20:27 says no familiar spirits or wizards. Deuteronomy in chapter 18 says no divination, no magic, no enchantments, no witchcraft, no charmers, no spirit talkers, wizards, necromancers, which I've always viewed as communing with the dead, but it's not necessarily clear what the distinctions were that the ancient Jews had when writing and talking about this. The Bible talks about demons, devils, witches, and more as if they're real. So the fantasy versions of those things exist to sort of soften, from the perspective of biblical literalist or fundamentalist, they exist to soften our rejection of them. Hey, it's only just fun. It's playtime. It's not real. These things come up around Halloween. There are plenty of Christian denominations that don't celebrate Halloween. There are plenty that actually also don't celebrate Christmas and things like that. But the Day of the Dead, dressing up, the taunting of the spirits, these are more pagan traditions. And while I was allowed to, I think I dressed as Dracula for, I don't know, a gazillion Halloweens in a row. That's how absolutely uncreative I was as a child. I liked the Dracula thing. I just kept doing it. And I think it's really partially for me that I didn't care that much about the Halloween and the dress up. It was like, I found the costume I like. Why would I keep changing it every year? But as I got to be a teenager, I branched out and had more fun. But if all of these games and other, fantasy versions of magic exist for the devil to use to make you weaker to when they actually do show up, then it would be a real concern. Now, when I was a teenager, I threw out rock music because of backward masking. There was a period of about a year where I think I listened to nothing but Petra and Carmen. And I definitely got rid of a lot of rock music. Backmasking we can talk about another time. It's not really part of this, but it's all part of the same thing. I avoided games. I avoided things that would have been fun exercises with my friends merely because they might open the door to being taken over by an evil spirit. I didn't ever play Pokemon, but I do play Magic the Gathering. I played it from beta onward. Played it yesterday, as a matter of fact. But it came along after the fear of those things had left me. I was old enough by time, 93 when that rolled around, that I had a healthy understanding of the difference, somewhat healthy understanding of the difference between fantasy magic and what I would have thought was real, but kind of doubted. Like, it didn't make sense to me that there was a devil actively trying to trick me by giving me a game to play so that he could take over, because it conflicted with the notion that I was already washed in the blood, had accepted Jesus as my Savior, and that nothing short of apostasy could ever take that away. So if I played a video game, maybe I was just a backslidden Christian, but I wasn't in danger of being possessed. I could never be possessed because I had the risen Christ living within me, or so I thought. For those who think that this is just an Old Testament thing, that's not even remotely the case. 1 Peter 5:8 says, be watchful because the devil is always looking for somebody to devour. In Matthew 12, there's a demon-possessed man, and there's several examples of this where Jesus and or apostles cast demons out of people. 1 John 4, chapter 4, verses 1-3 says, don't believe every spirit, but test to see if they're from God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh and is from God is real. And if a demon doesn't, or spirit doesn't confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, then it's not from God. Which makes one of the other passages in the Bible a little weird, because in Acts 16, verses 16-18, it talks about a possessed woman who had enriched her masters by her fortune-telling abilities. And she was following Paul around and basically telling people Paul is the servant of the Most High and will show you the path to salvation. Now, that doesn't expressly say Jesus Christ came in the flesh from God, but it seems to me that here was someone who had a spirit and was basically saying, yes, listen to Paul, he's telling you the truth. But this annoyed Paul so much that he decided to cast the demon out of her. And it's possible that there's some subtlety there that I'm missing where there's not a conflict between there, so I wouldn't recommend anybody go using this as a conflict. I just brought it up because when I was going through to find out verses that specifically referenced, demons and demon possession and things like that, these two came up back to back, and I was like, hang on, you've got a demon that's basically vouching for you, and you cast it out? Who knows? In the end, it doesn't really matter because there's no reason to think that any of this stuff is true. So the Paul story is a little confusing, but the mom in the Facebook thing is doing what she's been taught to do. She's doing what she thinks she needs to do to protect her kids. And this ties into something people ask me about my own parents. Why aren't you mad at your parents for forcing you to be a Christian or whatever? I've answered this many times. I'm not mad at them because they are just as much a victim of that mentality as I was. They were doing what they thought was best. If you believe this stuff is true, how awful would you have to be to not want to protect your kids and not want to teach your kids? So I'm not mad at them or even the preachers that I interacted with. Some of the preachers maybe because they clearly knew things that they weren't talking about, but most of the rest of them were just as confused and misled as the rest of us were. So while she doesn't, the mom here doesn't realize that this energy thing is a very specific instruction how to play the game. When she talks about how it was capitalized because it was deified, this is another thing that made me suspect maybe this wasn't real because that's important. It's essentially a keyword, the same as a keyword in Magic and Magic the Gathering. This thing about energy being attached is one of the actual rules of the game. It's how you read the card to figure out exactly what it does and does not do. But she doesn't care about that, and there's no reason for her to care. She's not trying to play a game. She's trying to protect her kids from a Christian boogeyman. And even if those cards aren't actually allowing him in, they're softening their heads and their hearts to allow for a potential future attack, at least as far as she can tell. Religions not only exploit our fears, but they create new fears and amplify them. They make you fearful of things that have never been demonstrated to be real. There's no more reason to believe in magic or energy attachment or demons than there is monsters under your bed, jinns, angels, leprechauns, gremlins, pixies, fairies, etc. Religions like Christianity and Judaism can make people believe in things and fearful of those things, despite no evidence that those things are real. It's worse than being quixotic because for most of them, there isn't even a windmill to tilt at in the first place. And this is incredibly useful because if they can make you afraid of something that only they can protect you from, then you become dependent upon them. And that religion thrives. Fear is the mind killer. Why be afraid of things that you don't understand? It's normal to be wary of things that you don't understand. But when you can investigate and find the truth, there's no reason to be fearful of ghost stories. See you next time. Bye-bye.